When we hear it described like that, it sounds really, really foolish. Roman Emperor Caligula said to, in AD 40, is said to have taken his legionnaires and to taken them and had them get their spears and their swords and their armaments and to go to the shores of the sea and literally attack the ocean. And after several hours of doing that, they were doing it, he claimed, to attack their pagan god Neptune, the god of the wrath of the sea. And after several hours of doing that, he stopped them, he declared victory, and had them kneel down and pick up seashells as the spoils of victory. When you describe it in those terms, it sounds awfully foolish. To have a god, at least that they had in their minds, as responsible for the sea, and then to turn around and try to attack it. And yet, when we're each honest, I'm guessing we could say that we've all had times or seasons in our lives when we've fought against, wrestled against, struggled with God. Perhaps we could even say that for the entirety of our lives up to this moment, we fought against the will of God. This morning we want to notice in Genesis chapter 32 when Jacob is introduced to the very glory of God. And when he is introduced to the glory of God, he realizes he's been wrestling with him all of his life. And he has the response that we each must have when we too get a glimpse of the glory of God. And that is to respond with full humility and surrender to the will of God. Let's open up to our Old Testament, Genesis chapter 32. We'll begin in verse 22, and then we'll rewind back into the text to lay some foundation from how we got here. But let's start in 32:22. The same night Jacob arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children. That's really 11 sons. Okay, Benjamin has not been born yet. He's got 12 children, 11 sons plus Dinah. He took those servants, the wives, the children. He crossed the ford of the Jabbok. That's a stream or a river, the northern boundary of the Canaan land where Jacob was raised, but from where Jacob has left to go north to Haran. Verse 23, he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And now notice the first clause of verse 24, and Jacob was left alone. First signpost in walking through this passage is that Jacob now faces isolation. It's amazing to think, and I've heard some this week, how often would Jacob have truly been alone before this night? All that he's amassed, all these wheelings and dealings he's had, was he ever truly alone before now? Well, how did he get here? Who is Jacob? How did he get here? We need to remember that really his story starts with being chosen by God as the patriarch of the covenant. Not the patriarch, but one of the patriarchs. Abraham, of course, was the first one the covenant was given to, Genesis 12. His son Isaac continued on the covenant. Remember, Isaac was actually Abraham's second born. Ishmael was born to Hagar, and then Isaac was born to Sarah. Jacob was born to Isaac and Rebekah, but remember, he's not the firstborn. He's a twin. Jacob's twin is Esau. Esau was born first, but when Esau was born, he came out with Jacob's hand latched onto his heel. That's foreshadowing. Long before Jacob was old enough to have this awareness of what he was actually doing, he was still, in a sense, foreshadowing the life he would have as a supplanter. So the name Jacob means heel or supplanter or schemer, negotiator, manipulator, something along those lines. Well, he's still the one through whom the whole world will be blessed, and God will make a mighty nation, the Jews. What happens over the course of time is that even though he's the younger born, he's been the son of promise. So Esau one day is parched. He's been out hunting. He's not been in the tent, and he comes back, and he thinks he's going to die, so he negotiates. Jacob and he negotiate for the birthright. Jacob receives the birthright over the course of that stew, in exchange for that stew. Makes Esau mad. It makes Isaac mad. All of this drama continues to unfold. So then in chapter 27 of Genesis, that's all in 25, in 27 of Genesis, Rebekah overhears Isaac having a plan. Isaac is going to kind of try to right some wrongs. He thinks he's about to die soon, so he says, I'm going to set up a ceremony for me and Esau to make this thing right. I'm going to give my blessing to Esau once and for all. Rebekah hears it. And Rebekah dresses up Jacob like Esau with the hairy arms. And he goes into Isaac, and Isaac unknowingly gives the blessing to Jacob instead. So now Jacob has received the birthright with the transaction with he and Esau, and he's received the blessing directly from Isaac. And he meets Esau on the way out. They figure out what's happened. Esau is angry. He tries to receive some of the blessing, but it's too late. By the end of Genesis 27, Esau, Jacob's twin brother, has vowed to kill him. Look at what he's taken from me. When Isaac dies, I will exact vengeance and kill my brother. Jacob has this pattern. Not only did that happen with his brother and his dad and his mom, but anywhere he turned, he was this schemer and negotiator. Even the beloved passage of chapter 28, he sees this vision overnight. He has this dream of angels and the ladder, and God speaks to him and reminds him, you're the son of the covenant. But even then, it seems as though Jacob's perspective toward God is great and all as long as he serves my purposes. He views himself as a master negotiator even as it relates to God. What happens beginning in chapter 29 is that this relational strife takes on a whole other level when he meets another schemer. He enters what we might even call a toxic or codependent relationship with the man who becomes his father-in-law, Laban. And he moves far to the north, up closer to what we would think about being kind of Babylon area, the area of Haran. And he falls in love with Laban's younger daughter, Rachel. And Laban schemes a way to get his older daughter married off, Leah. Jacob marries her and then ends up marrying Rachel after that. So now Jacob is on the receiving end. He knows what it's like to become the victim of this scheming. He keeps building this relational strife. He eventually has these children by 4 different women. Here on the banks of the river, he's had 11 of the 12 boys. Benjamin isn't born until chapter 35. But he's had 11 of the boys by 4 different women. He's had Dinah too. So between Rachel, Leah, and their servants, he's brought 12 children into the world. That's not God's plan for marriage and reproduction, to have those children by that many women. And he's got this toxic relationship with Laban. It's in chapter 31 that he receives a message from God. It's time for you to go back to the land of your kindred. That continues the scheming between he and Laban. They each try to outmatch each other. Rachel enters in and tries to kind of get her way through it all. But what Jacob hears and understands is true. When we pack up everything and we go back to where I came from, that means I've got to deal with this Esau problem. My twin brother is still nearby. He's in Edom. He's not directly in Canaan, but he's close enough by to where he knows all those things that happened 20 years ago are about to come to a head. I've ran from them as long as I could. So one preacher intentionally worded it this way: as Jacob is there on the shores of the river. Hosea's account that Chad read for us in our Bible reading, he mentions that he was praying. He had this agony. So maybe he's praying. There is a prayer in chapter 32, verses 9 through 12. But it's as though Jacob is focused in his mind on a statement similar to this: I'm going to meet once and for all the one I've been fighting all my life. And he would have thought it was Esau. So he's there on the banks, and he's all alone in isolation, ready for the night, trying to be protective as he can. He's tried to outwit and outsmart and out-scheme Esau if he can to curry his favor. But now it's time to meet him, he thinks. So let's pick up where we left off in verse 24. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Now we're first told that this encounter is with a man. But by the end of verse 25, it's clear he's not just a man. He appeared as a man. He had the form of some kind of a man-like person, being. But when his man-like strength is met blow for blow by Jacob, he exercises supernatural strength. And the word for touch here in the verse 25 is a Hebrew word for to barely touch, lightly touch. You know, when you're breaking down maybe a chicken or a turkey and you've got the joints that you've got to pull apart, it still takes quite a bit of effort. Even if you have, say, a knife or a mallet, you still have to know exactly where you're going to hit, and it still takes some strength. Well, as Jacob's wrestling and contending with this being, the being exercises a perfect knowledge of his anatomy, of his hip. Puts his hip out of socket, but it doesn't render him paralyzed, it doesn't crush him. But it also sends a clear message that he is far more than a man. When you take all the accounts together, you're going to see later that Jacob is going to call this, quote, man, God. The Hosea account that we read from chapter 12 calls him God and then calls him an angel. So it's clear this is God in some form, appearing like a man, at first restraining himself as a man, and then exercising supernatural strength and overpowering Jacob and wounding his hip. He could no longer fight. He could no longer continue the battle on the shores, but instead has now learned something far more important than his battle with Esau is happening. This is the part that gets the most attention, no doubt. As we read this story, we read about this incredible encounter where he wrestles on the banks of the river. But notice carefully how it's the verses that follow, beginning in verse 26, where we learn the importance of what's just happened. Where Jacob goes from being a lifelong schemer to being one who faithfully trusts in God. Notice the realization it's clear Jacob has had. Let's look at verse 26. We'll read through 30. Then he said, the man said, the figure said, God says, let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said to him, the being, God, says to him, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. It's in the course of this conversation and the wound immediately preceding it that Jacob learns this is no man, this is not Esau, this is no mere mortal. This is God. And he learns that he's been wrestling God all of his life. So this moment, Jacob has learned both the power and the restraint of God. Because he has now been wounded, he can no longer fight as he had been fighting. He learns that God could have done far more. He could have hurt far more than his hip. He could have killed him easily and quickly. And he also learns he should have killed me. I'm deserving of far worse than a hip that's been pulled out of socket. This being has the knowledge, has the precision, but also the restraint. To wake me up, to let me see exactly who he is, but also to spare my life, even though I deserved death. Because we know this is God in some form, we begin to see the power of some of these phrases. You'll notice that he says, let me go, for the day has broken. Why is that important? As the sun begins to rise, you have this thread throughout Scripture that no man can see the face of God and live. So if the sun rises and Jacob beholds in a more full sense the glory of God, Jacob dies. Knowing that, notice now how important it is that Jacob did not let him go. I will not let you go Even if it costs me my life, I'm going to hold on to you unless you will bless me. It might sound at first as though Jacob is back to this negotiating mode, but everything has changed. He's saying, I will not let you go. I'm not leaving this moment without having been changed by you. Either I'm clinging to you or I will leave with a blessing from you, but everything is different now because I fully see who you are and that I've been running from you. He's been aware of God, no doubt. He's had the angel vision. He knew the covenant promises. But almost always, his vision of what God was going to do was always tied to what he could get out of it. And there's an interesting kind of wordplay that happens prior to this, because you see the covenant promise in Genesis 28, and then in verses 9 through 12, you see Jacob praying. There's a sense of humility before this, but it's not quite fully developed. He quotes almost verbatim the promise from chapter 28. But instead of God, when God says, I will be with you, Jacob pulls that part out. And he says, I know you will do me good. I know you will serve me. It's kind of the sense that he prays in chapter 32. But notice how things have changed over the course of a night of wrestling with God. Instead of begging for God to just simply give Jacob what Jacob wants, he says, I want to be with you and cling to you, or if I can't do that, I want you to give me what you deem best. I want your presence, and I want your constant blessing. I no longer view God as the one who's here to just give me what I want. I'm here to give him my life and all things. I want to be in his presence. It's in the throes of his pain, it's in the throes of his weakness that he holds on to God's presence. He was willing to go to death, if necessary, just to hold on to God. And so the main idea that we need to emphasize is that when we behold the glory of God, he allows us to do that so that we will be humbled and then fully surrender to his will. As Jacob beheld the power, the strength, but also the mercy of God, it humbled him into a posture of surrender and submission. We might rightly remember this for being the time that Jacob wrestles. That's what we've titled it this morning. But perhaps a more accurate summary is that Jacob clings. Jacob holds on to. When all of his physical strength has now left him, what does he do? He still holds on. Holds on to God. It's interesting that the Apostle Paul has a bit of a similar experience as Jacob. He's had God in his life his whole life. He's trained among the best of the best. And yet he has to realize that he's actually been fighting against God ever since Christ came. People obeyed Christ and the church was established. It's in Acts 26. It's a typo on the screen. It's Acts 26, verse 14, that the Lord says to Paul, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. You're kicking and fighting against me and my will and my people, and you're the one who's getting hurt. You might think that you're in the position of power, that you're getting what you want, and yet you're the one that's suffering. Or similarly, Jacob had room for God in his life, but he had also been against God in terms of how he went about receiving it. He was trying to do it his way, scheme and lie and deceive, just for an outcome that he had in mind. I think this is consistent with the passage in James chapter 4, where James addresses infighting within the church. He says, you want to know why this keeps happening? It's because you approach God selfishly. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Don't we love the promise of verse 8? Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. How often do we stop halfway through verse 8? Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. What does drawing near to God involve? Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched, mourn, weep. It's a terrifying thing to draw near to God when it reminds us of how we have gone against him and fought against him. He promises to lift us up when we humble ourselves before him. Jacob had room for God in his life, But he hadn't submitted and surrendered fully to God. And now that's the realization he's having on the shores of this river. The night before what he thinks is going to be the single most important day of his life. But also, as we move through the text, we see the importance of the process of confession. Remember, all the principles are really coming to light in this conversation they have. God asks, what's your name? He's not asking because he doesn't know. Anybody who's going to find Jacob on the shores alone that night is going to know Jacob's name. God knows his name. He's asking, are you willing to own your name? He could have said, I'm the son of Isaac, I'm the grandson of Abraham. He could have said any number of things, but he simply responded with Jacob. I'm the swindler. I'm the schemer. I'm the heel. I'm the master negotiator, the master manipulator. He's confessing that he has, quote, lived up to his name, a name of a poor reputation. That although it's been about the things of God, he's went about it the wrong way. And it's because of that confession that God then says, you'll no longer have to be called by that name alone. I'm giving you a new name, Israel. And of course, God defines that name for him. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Israel means God fights, God prevails. And now Jacob has that name, and his people will forever have that name because he engaged with God, had his life changed in the moment. He decided once and for all to stop wrestling and instead start clinging to God instead. God promises and allows us to have a new name, a new existence, a new creation when we are willing to own our part, to own our responsibility in sinning against him. And also when we're willing to let go of that old life, which is what Jacob is doing here. But notice there are signs, clear signs of transformation, which is where this closes with Jacob's existence. Jacob's life from here on is different. He's not perfect, but it's different. There's clear signs of transformation that happen. Jacob asks, what's your name? Please tell me your name. There's just a deep principle about name and face and blessing and favor all throughout the Old Testament. And so he's had his name changed, and he wants to know the name of God. And God says, why is it you want to know my name? And then he's silent, doesn't tell him. But he does bless him. We don't know what that entailed. We know that Jacob saw this as a turning point moment because he names that place Peniel. I have seen God. I've beheld his glory. I've experienced God in a way I've never experienced him before. And yet I've still been delivered. I could have died. I should have died. And yet I've been spared. So that's the first level of transformation that we see. Prior to this time, he had been fighting against God. He had been running from God. He'd been running from Esau. But now, even in the midst of his pain, he chooses to cling to God instead of turning toward him or against him and running from. It's so important that we realize that the fear response, what we commonly call fight or flight, sometimes now you hear thrown in the freeze option. We just naturally, as human beings, as, quote, animals, we do those things when we're afraid. And we can easily and do easily do them just as quickly to God and what he tells us to do and how to live. And in this moment, when Jacob's strength has been removed from him and he's in pain, his hip is now dislocated, he doesn't fight, he doesn't flee. He's not paralyzed beyond his thinking. He clings. He clings to God. His whole response has changed. Every way that he's been living for the previous decades is now different. He did face the one from whom he had been running and the one who he had been fighting all of his life, but it was not Esau. He finally realized he had been running from and avoiding learning from God himself. In order to be truly blessed by God, to receive these promises, Jacob learned he had to be crippled of his own self-sufficiency. It was far more than a physical wound. He needed to learn, I cannot and will not do all of this all on my own. I can no longer be this master schemer or negotiator. You see evidence of that beginning in verse 31. The sun rose upon him as he passed another place, Penuel. So he crosses the river. He passes another place on the way to see Esau and Edom. And he's limping, notice, because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that's on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. So both 31 and 32 remind us of the importance of reminders, that Jacob has a constant reminder of this night and a constant reminder to not run to his own self-strength and own self-sufficiency, but instead to run toward and cling to God. Here's the question for us. If given the choice, would I choose a life without the limp, but also without God? Or do I choose to walk with God and follow God no matter what and no matter where, even though it involves the limp? That's a decision Jacob had to decide. That's the decision we each must decide in coming before God and seeing, beholding His glory. This is, again, a principle that Paul is going to wrestle with. He's going to communicate it to the church at Corinth in defending himself. He says, we have this treasure in jars of clay. That's a parallel phrase to the limp. He's saying we're not perfect people. We're broken. We've had to go through a lot. But why is it important that the glory of the gospel is seen in jars of clay? So that the world knows and that we know the surpassing power belongs not to us, but to God. If it's a beautiful vessel, if it's a perfect vessel, if it's gold, if it's silver, if it's rare jewels, then people look at the vessel for the vessel's sake. And Paul says when they see the earthenness in our lives, they see God, not us. So he connects it to the cross even of Jesus, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. You see the limp of Jacob in that? Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. Paul is suffering in the flesh. And he says, that's because Jesus suffered in the flesh for us. My limps and my scars are all because of what I suffered for Christ, for the purpose that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. You see it come up again in chapter 12, the thorn in the flesh passage. Brother Dan mentioned that Saturday night of our meeting last week. No matter what the thorn of the flesh ends up being, the principles are what's most important. God said to Paul, my grace is enough. My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. My power is not complete. It's not mature in your life until you see it meeting and fulfilling your weaknesses. And you're content in your weaknesses, knowing that my grace is seen in your life this way. So Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses. So that's Jacob walking around with this limp and saying, hey, did you see this? This is proof of God's mercy. This is proof of God's grace and goodness. It's not for the sake of attention. It's not for the sake of pity. It's for the sake of seeing our God. That His strength is fulfilled in our weaknesses. So he says, verse 10, for the sake of Christ then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. When I'm weak, then I am strong. If we think we don't have a limp, that's the time for us to dive into the Word of God and let it humble us. If we struggle to know, but perhaps, what is my limp? What is it that I bear in my body and in my life? Maybe the list of verse 10 will help us to see what is it that Paul endured? What is it that I must endure? Where is it that I've seen the mercy and the forgiveness of God? And the world might not be able to explain it. But through the gospel and through the mercy of God, He is being seen in my life. There's further evidence in Jacob's life of transformation. You remember the tension as you approach the passage is between him and Esau. But God interrupts that. And he learns, I've been running from God and fighting against him the whole time. And now everything changes that night and early that morning. He goes off with this new life direction. It's in chapter 33, though, that he meets Esau. And there's a beautiful picture of reconciliation. It's as though he no longer has fear, and if Esau is going to kill me, then so be it. He bows humbly. He's out in front of his family. That's a pretty important detail. He's not afraid. He's not hiding behind them. Esau is penitent. He's penitent. They hug each other. And one of the things that Jacob says to Esau is in chapter 33, verse 10. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God. He said that to Esau. So after nearly seeing the face of God on the banks of the Jabbok, having his life changed completely by repenting, by confessing, he now sees his estranged brother and is able to say, it's like seeing the face of God. Everything has changed because of the mercy and the grace God has shown to me. The reconciliation they needed started with Jacob's reconciliation with God. See, wrestling with God during seasons or for all of our lives, it's going to create relational collateral damage. The way to put it back together is not to put it back together on our own and then turn to God. It's to turn to God. And with his ways and his strength and our weakness, allow him to repair and put the pieces back together. Drew Kaiser preaches for the church in Leeds, Alabama. He's written a book on Jacob called The Favored Cheat. And he says it's this moment where Jacob goes from being the cheat to actually being the favored one. The name changes from Jacob to Israel. And it's because of his humility and his surrender that he then shows us how to respond to God's glory. It begins to meet the purposes and the promises of God. God allows us to behold his glory so that we might respond with full humility and surrender to his will. I don't know how you've been perhaps running from or wrestling against or fighting against God this morning, whether that's for a season or a short time or for all of your life. But God doesn't want you to stay in that state. And in fact, he's done far more than what he did for Jacob here. He has sent Jesus Christ. We're reminded that God chose to receive the ultimate wound. Instead of inflicting us with the wounds that we deserved, those were all poured on to Christ. Instead of crushing us, Christ received the crushing of our sin and our evil. And it's because of that sacrifice, and it's because of that salvation made possible through a sacrifice, we can experience transformation into that new creature, that while we may walk with a limp, while we may be jars of clay, we do so for the glory of God, that others might see God and want to know him as well. If you need to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ by putting him on in baptism, choose now is the time you do that. We'd love to assist you in making that decision. Maybe you've been running from him or you've been fighting against him as a Christian and you know that you're not right with him. You need forgiveness. You need to make a declaration of repentance. Please know that we're here for you. We'd love to help you with that, to pray with you, to do whatever's necessary to help you. Use this time, use this song to come to God as we sing.